It was a bright afternoon in the heart of the city, the kind of day when crowds move slowly and conversations blend into a constant hum. Inside a busy outdoor cafe near a shopping plaza, people laughed, clinked cups, and scrolled through their phones, unaware that a moment was about to change the mood completely. She stood near the counter, calm and composed, dressed simply, waiting for her order. There was nothing about her that invited attention, no loud voice, no dramatic gestures, just patience. As she turned slightly to make room for others, a man behind her bumped into her shoulder. "Watch where you're going," he snapped. She turned, surprised, and replied politely, "I'm sorry, I didn't see you there." That should have been the end of it. But the man was already angry, his jaw tight, his voice sharp. "You people are always acting like you own the place," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. She took a breath, choosing calm over conflict. "There's no problem," she said evenly. "Let's just move on." Instead of calming him, her composure seemed to fuel his temper. He stepped closer, invading her space. Nearby conversations slowed. A few heads turned. Someone sensed the tension and reached for their phone. "You think you can talk back to me?" he said, his tone rising. "You should learn some respect." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult him. She simply met his eyes and said, "Please don't speak to me like that." In a split second, the air changed. The man lifted his hand and struck her across the face. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Sharp, unmistakable. The cafe fell silent. Cups froze mid-air. A chair scraped the floor as someone stood up in shock. She staggered half a step back, stunned, her hand slowly rising to her cheek. Not a scream, not a word, just disbelief. People stared. Some gasped. Others instinctively pulled out their phones, recording instead of reacting. A few looked around, expecting someone, anyone, to intervene. The man straightened himself, chest out, as if daring someone to challenge him. "Mind your own business," he barked at the crowd. "This doesn't concern you." She stood there, breathing steadily, refusing to break down in public. Then, quietly, she reached into her bag and took out her phone. Her hands didn't shake. She made a call. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm okay. I need you to come here." She ended the call and looked back at the man, calm, steady, unafraid. What no one in that cafe knew at that moment was simple and terrifying for him. The person she had just called was her husband, and his name was Steven Seagal. For a few long seconds after the strike, no one moved. The cafe, once full of noise and chatter, felt frozen in time. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the background music seemed too loud now, awkwardly playing over a moment that demanded silence. Every pair of eyes was locked on the woman standing near the counter, her hand still resting lightly on her cheek. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. Instead, she took a slow breath, grounding herself, refusing to give the man the reaction he seemed to crave. Around her, people shifted uncomfortably. A young couple whispered to each other. An older man frowned but stayed seated. Several phones were now clearly raised, red recording lights blinking. Everyone was watching, yet no one stepped forward. The man who had struck her noticed the phones and scoffed. "Yeah, record it," he said loudly, spreading his arms. "I don't care. She deserved it." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. The woman lowered her hand and met his gaze. Her voice was calm, controlled. "You had no right to touch me." He laughed, a short, mocking sound. "What are you going to do about it?" She didn't answer him. Instead, she turned slightly away, giving herself space, her posture steady. That quiet confidence only seemed to irritate him more. "You think you're better than me?" he continued, his voice rising again. "Standing there like you're above everyone?" A barista behind the counter looked panicked, glancing toward the manager, who hesitated, clearly unsure whether to intervene or call security. The tension was thick enough to feel. The woman looked around briefly, not for help, but to take in her surroundings. Dozens of strangers, dozens of witnesses. And still, she stood alone. Then she spoke again, firmly this time. "This is over. Leave me alone." The man stepped closer, pointing a finger inches from her face. "Or what?" Before anyone could stop her, she reached into her bag once more. Not hurried, not frantic, just deliberate. She pulled out her phone again and unlocked it. The man smirked. "Calling the police?" he mocked. "Go ahead." She didn't respond. She simply raised the phone to her ear. "Yes," she said quietly when the call connected. "I'm still here. He hasn't left." There was a pause as she listened, her eyes never leaving the man in front of her. "Please," she added, "just come." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag. The man crossed his arms. "You think someone's coming to save you?" he said, shaking his head. This is real life, but something had shifted. The crowd sensed it. The woman's calm wasn't weakness, it was certainty. Whatever fear might have existed earlier was gone, replaced by patience, like someone who knew the ending of the story and was simply waiting for it to arrive. A few people in the cafe began to whisper more urgently now. "Did you see her face? She's not scared at all. Who did she call?" Someone near the window glanced outside, as if expecting something, or someone to appear. The man, unaware of what was coming, continued to posture, feeding off the attention. "This is what happens when people forget their place," he said loudly. Several in the crowd visibly flinched at his words. The woman didn't respond. She stood tall, silent, composed, her dignity intact, despite what had just happened to her in public. And as the seconds passed, the atmosphere changed again, not with fear this time, but anticipation. Because somewhere nearby, footsteps were already moving in her direction, and very soon, the man who thought he had all the power was going to realize just how wrong he was. The seconds stretched uncomfortably after the call ended. At first, nothing happened. No sirens, no sudden interruptions, just the low hum of the cafe returning in uneasy fragments, chairs shifting, nervous coughs, the faint clatter of cups being set down too hard. But the tension didn't leave. It thickened. The man watched the woman closely now, his confidence slowly morphing into irritation. He had expected tears, shouting, panic, something that would confirm his sense of control. Instead, she stood there calmly, her shoulders squared, her expression steady. It unsettled him. "What are you waiting for?" he sneered. "Your hero?" She didn't answer. That silence hit harder than any insult could have. It made him feel ignored, unimportant, and that was something his ego couldn't tolerate. He took another step toward her, deliberately slow, too close. "You think this is over?" he said quietly, his voice edged with threat. "You embarrassed me in front of all these people." A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone else muttered, "Back off, man," but their voice lacked conviction. The words fell flat, swallowed by fear and uncertainty. The woman finally spoke, her tone calm but firm. "Step away from me." The man laughed again, but it sounded forced this time. "Or what?" he repeated, louder, making sure everyone could hear. "What are you going to do?" She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She simply held her ground. That was when the mood in the cafe truly shifted. People began to realize this wasn't just an argument anymore. This was intimidation. A few patrons stood up from their seats, not quite intervening, but no longer willing to pretend nothing was happening. A man near the entrance subtly positioned himself closer, as if preparing to step in if things got worse. The aggressor noticed the movement and turned toward the crowd, spreading his arms again. "What?" he shouted. "Anyone got a problem?" No one answered. Phones were still recording. Faces were tight with anxiety. He smirked, emboldened by the silence. Then he turned back to the woman. "You should have kept your mouth shut," he said. "Now you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be." She looked at him steadily. "You made it a big deal, the moment you put your hands on me." Her words were measured, not emotional, but they cut deep. His jaw tightened. The attention he had drawn was no longer feeding his ego. It was exposing him. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only she and a few nearby listeners could hear. "You don't know who you're messing with." Before she could respond, a voice from behind the counter finally broke through the tension. "Sir," the cafe manager said, trying to sound authoritative but clearly shaken, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man spun around. "Stay out of this." "It is my business," the manager replied. "You assaulted a customer." For a brief moment, it looked like the man might explode. His fists clenched. His chest rose and fell rapidly. The crowd collectively held its breath. Then he laughed short, sharp, and humorless. "You hear that?" he said to the woman, jerking his thumb toward the manager. "Now they care." She said nothing. That was when he made his biggest mistake. He reached out not to strike her again, but to grab her wrist. Gasps erupted instantly. A chair scraped loudly as someone stood up. The man near the entrance stepped forward now, voice raised. Hey, don't touch her. The aggressor released her wrist immediately, startled by the sudden pushback. He took a step back, eyes darting around the room. For the first time, he looked unsure. The woman calmly adjusted her sleeve, her composure still intact, though her eyes had hardened. This ends now, she said. The man scoffed, but the bravado was fading. Yeah? And who's going to stop me? Almost on cue, the cafe door opened. It wasn't dramatic at first. No loud entrance, no shouting, just the subtle shift of attention as several people instinctively turned toward the doorway. A tall figure stepped inside. Broad shoulders, solid build, calm, deliberate movements. He scanned the room once quickly, efficiently, his eyes landing immediately on the woman. She looked at him and nodded. That's him, she said quietly. The aggressor followed her gaze, sizing up the newcomer. He snorted. What is this? He said. Your backup? The man didn't respond right away. He took a few slow steps forward, placing himself between the woman and the aggressor, not aggressively, not theatrically. Just enough. The room felt different now. The air was heavier, quieter. The aggressor straightened up, trying to reclaim his confidence. You got a problem? He asked, puffing out his chest. The newcomer finally spoke. His voice was low, even, almost calm to the point of being unsettling. You touched her? He said. Not a question, a statement. The aggressor hesitated for half a second, just long enough for several people in the crowd to exchange looks. Something about this man felt different, but the aggressor forced a laugh. And, who are you supposed to be? The man didn't answer. He simply stood there, eyes steady, presence unshakable. And somewhere in the crowd, a quiet whisper began to spread. Is that Steven Seagal? The aggressor hadn't heard it yet, but he was about to. For a moment, the cafe existed in a strange stillness. The man who had just entered stood between the woman and the aggressor, not saying a word. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't puff out his chest or try to look intimidating, yet his presence alone seemed to press down on the room, like a sudden drop in air pressure before a storm. The aggressor sized him up, forcing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. So, he said, tilting his head. You her boyfriend or something? The man didn't react. He remained still, his posture relaxed but solid, as if rooted to the floor. I asked you a question, the aggressor snapped, louder now, clearly trying to reclaim control. You got a problem with me? The woman placed a gentle hand on the man's arm. It wasn't a gesture of fear. It was reassurance. Yes, she said calmly. He's my husband. A ripple of quiet surprise moved through the crowd. The aggressor laughed. Your husband? He shook his head mockingly. Good. Then you can take your wife and leave before things get worse. The man finally spoke again, his voice still low, still controlled. Things already went too far. That was it. Just 4 words. But the way he said them made several people in the cafe straighten in their seats. The aggressor scoffed. You threatening me? No, the man replied. I'm stating a fact. The tension was thick enough to taste. Even the phone's recording seemed to lower slightly, as if people didn't want to miss a second of what might happen next. The aggressor took a step closer, stopping inches from the man's face. He was taller by a fraction, and he used it, leaning in, trying to dominate the space. You don't scare me, he said. Not you. Not anyone. The man didn't move. He didn't even blink. Behind them, whispers began to spread again, quiet at first, then more insistent. Wait. He looks familiar. I've seen him before. No way. Is that who I think it is? A woman near the window squinted, lowering her phone slightly. Her eyes widened. Oh my God, she whispered. That's Steven Seagal. The name didn't explode through the cafe. It didn't need to. It traveled like electricity. Quick, silent, undeniable. Steven Seagal, actor, martial artist, action legend. Several people's expressions changed instantly. Shock replaced fear. Recognition replaced uncertainty. Some phones adjusted angles, zooming in now, not on the aggressor but on the man standing calmly in the center of it all. The aggressor, oblivious to the whispers behind him, continued talking. You think you're some kind of tough guy? He said. I've dealt with guys like you before. Steven tilted his head slightly, finally meeting the man's eyes fully. I'm not a tough guy, he said. I'm a calm one. The words landed harder than a threat ever could. The aggressor hesitated. just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. The woman who had whispered earlier couldn't contain herself. "Sir," she said aloud, voice shaking with disbelief. "You know that's Steven Seagal, right?" Silence slammed into the room. The aggressor turned slowly, scanning the faces around him. The looks he saw weren't fearful anymore. They were expectant. Some were almost sympathetic. "What?" he said, frowning. "That man," someone else added, "is Steven Seagal." The aggressor laughed once sharp, dismissive. "Yeah, okay," he said. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" Steven didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. A few people nodded. Others whispered again, louder this time. "It is him. I saw him in movies. He's a martial arts master." The aggressor's smile faded. He looked back at Steven, studying him more carefully now, the stance, the calm, the complete lack of fear. Something clicked. His shoulders stiffened. You're serious?" Steven spoke quietly. "This isn't about who I am," he said. "It's about what you did." The woman stepped slightly closer to her husband. The gesture was small, but meaningful. The aggressor swallowed. For the first time since the incident began, he looked uncertain. The confidence that had fueled his behavior earlier was draining fast, replaced by something colder and sharper realization. The cafe manager stepped forward again, emboldened now by the shift in power. "Sir," he said firmly to the aggressor, "the police are on their way." The aggressor nodded absently, his eyes never leaving Steven. "You called the cops?" he muttered. "No," Steven replied. "Someone else did." The crowd murmured in agreement. The aggressor took a step back, then another, as if creating space to think. His earlier aggression felt misplaced now, dangerous even. Steven didn't advance. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. The message was clear without a single strike thrown. This situation was no longer in the aggressor's control, and as the sound of distant sirens began to bleed faintly into the air, one thing became undeniable to everyone in the cafe. The man who had struck a woman in public had just realized he'd made the worst mistake of his life. The room no longer belonged to the man who had caused the chaos. Moments earlier, he had filled the cafe with his voice loud, aggressive, demanding attention. Now, he stood several steps back, silent, his confidence leaking away with every second that passed. The realization had settled in, heavy and unavoidable. This was no ordinary situation anymore. Steven Seagal remained where he was, positioned calmly between his wife and the man. He hadn't touched him. He hadn't raised his voice. Yet the balance of power had shifted completely. "You hit her," Steven said again, slowly this time, not louder, not angrier, just clearer. The aggressor swallowed. It was nothing," he muttered. "Just a misunderstanding." Steven tilted his head slightly. "A misunderstanding doesn't leave a mark." The words were simple, but they cut through the air like a blade. Several people in the cafe nodded instinctively. Someone whispered, "He's right." The aggressor tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked halfway through. "Look, man, let's not blow this out of proportion. Everyone's recording. Let's all just calm down." Steven glanced briefly at the phones around them, then back at the man. "You weren't worried about proportion when you raised your hand," he said. "You were worried about control." The man stiffened. "You don't know me. I know enough," Steven replied. "I know you thought no one would stop you." Silence followed. The woman stood beside her husband now, her posture steady, her expression composed. She wasn't hiding behind him, she was standing with him. The message was clear. She wasn't weak, and she wasn't alone. The aggressor shifted his weight, looking around the cafe. The faces staring back at him weren't passive anymore. There was judgment in their eyes, disappointment. Some even showed anger, not explosive, but firm. "You're all acting like I'm some kind of monster," he snapped, trying one last time to reclaim the narrative. Steven didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took one slow step forward. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. But it was deliberate. The aggressor instinctively stepped back. Steven stopped, respecting the space. But the message was unmistakable. "You don't control this anymore. You're not a monster," Steven said evenly. "You're a man who made a choice, and now you're facing it." The aggressor clenched his fists, then loosened them again, his body betraying his nerves. "What do you want?" he asked. "An apology?" Steven considered him for a moment. I want you to understand something, he said. Real strength isn't dominance. It's restraint. The man scoffed weakly. Easy for you to say. Steven nodded once. That's true, he said. Because I've learned it the hard way. A low murmur rippled through the cafe. The words carried weight not because of Steven's fame, but because of his presence. He wasn't performing. He was teaching. You could have walked away, Steven continued. You could have apologized. But you chose violence because you thought there would be no consequence. The aggressor looked down briefly, then back up. His voice was quieter now. I lost my temper. Steven didn't argue. Everyone does, he said. But not everyone raises their hand. The distant sound of sirens grew louder outside, no longer faint, no longer ignorable. The cafe manager exhaled slowly, relief washing over his face. The aggressor's breathing became shallow. I didn't know who she was, he said quickly, as if that explained everything. Steven's eyes hardened not with anger, but with disappointment. That's the problem, he said. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. That sentence landed like a verdict. The woman finally spoke, her voice calm but unwavering. I don't want him hurt, she said. I want him held accountable. Steven turned to her and nodded. That's exactly what's going to happen. The aggressor looked between them, panic flickering across his face. Come on, he said. Let's just end this here. Steven shook his head slightly. This ends when you take responsibility. Outside, blue and red lights began to flash against the cafe windows. A collective exhale moved through the room. The crowd knew what was coming. The aggressor ran a hand through his hair, his earlier arrogance completely gone now. I'm sorry, he muttered. The words rushed, unsteady. Steven studied him carefully. Say it like you mean it. The man hesitated, then turned toward the woman. His shoulders slumped. I'm sorry, he said again, this time slower. I was wrong. The woman met his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply acknowledged the moment with quiet dignity. That apology is for her, Steven said. The consequences are for the law. Footsteps sounded near the entrance as police officers approached. The aggressor closed his eyes briefly, knowing there was no escape left. Steven stepped back, placing himself slightly beside his wife instead of in front of her now. The message was clear. Protection had never meant control. As the officers entered and began assessing the situation, the cafe felt different, lighter, calmer, but marked by something important. A line had been drawn, not with fists, not with violence, but with restraint, accountability, and unmistakable moral authority. And for the man who had struck a woman in public, the turning point had arrived, one he would never forget. The police officers entered the cafe with practiced calm, their eyes scanning the room before settling on the tense circle at its center. One officer approached the manager. Another moved closer to Steven and his wife, while a third kept his focus on the aggressor, who now stood stiff and silent, hands visible, posture defensive. What happened here? The lead officer asked. Before anyone else could speak, several voices answered at once. He hit her. We saw everything. It's on video. Phones were raised again, this time not to provoke, but to document. The truth was no longer fragile. It was solid, recorded from multiple angles, impossible to erase. The officer nodded, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. He turned to the woman. Ma'am, are you okay? She took a breath. I am now, she said. But he struck me. In public. Without provocation. The officer turned to the aggressor. Is that true? The man hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. His shoulders dropped. Yes, he said quietly. I lost my temper. The words felt small compared to the damage they carried. As the officer began asking follow-up questions, another cop, older, more experienced, stepped closer to Steven. He studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly, then widening with recognition. Sir, the officer said, lowering his voice. You're Steven Seagal, aren't you? Steven gave a small nod. Yes. The officer's expression shifted not to awe, but to understanding. I appreciate how you handled this, he said. A lot of people wouldn't. Steven didn't respond immediately. This wasn't about me, he said finally. It was about stopping it from getting worse. The aggressor overheard the exchange. his face drained of color. Steven Seagal. The name hit him harder than any accusation. He looked down at the floor, shame finally replacing denial. One of the officers gently but firmly guided the man's hands behind his back. "You're being detained for assault," he said. "You have the right to remain silent." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the cafe. It wasn't loud, but it was final. The man didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, defeated, his earlier bravado completely gone. As he was led toward the exit, he turned once more, toward the woman. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I really am." She looked at him carefully. "I hope you learn from this," she replied, "because the next person might not walk away." He nodded, unable to meet her eyes, and disappeared through the door with the officers. The cafe exhaled as one. People lowered their phones. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to each other, replaying the moment in hushed disbelief. What they had just witnessed wasn't a movie scene, it was real, raw, and unsettling. The manager approached Steven and his wife. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping this from turning into something worse." Steven placed a hand lightly on his wife's shoulder. "She did that," he said. "I just showed up." She gave him a small, appreciative smile. An officer returned to them, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, we'll need a statement from you," he said gently, "and we'll follow up with next steps." She nodded. Of course, as the formalities continued, a few people in the cafe quietly approached Steven, not for autographs, not for photos, but to express something deeper. "You handled that with so much restraint," one man said. "My daughter was watching," a woman added. "Thank you for setting that example." Steven nodded politely. "Violence doesn't end violence," he said. "Responsibility does." When the officers finished their work, the cafe slowly returned to life. Chairs were rearranged, orders were resumed, but something had changed. The space felt marked by the moment, a reminder of how quickly ordinary days can turn dangerous, and how powerful, calm courage can be. Before leaving, Steven and his wife stepped outside together. The afternoon light felt different now, sharper, clearer. Reporters were already gathering across the street, tipped off by social media uploads spreading rapidly online. Steven paused, knowing what was coming. One reporter called out, "Mr. Seagal, do you have a comment about what happened inside?" Steven considered his words carefully. "Yes," he said. "No one should ever be touched in anger, not in private, not in public. Strength isn't about how hard you hit. It's about knowing when not to." The clip would later be shared millions of times. As they walked away, his wife squeezed his hand. "Thank you for standing with me," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Always," he replied. And somewhere behind them, the story was already evolving, no longer just about an assault, but about accountability, dignity, and the choice every person has when faced with injustice. The consequences had been set in motion. What remained now was the lesson and whether the world would listen. By the next morning, the cafe incident was everywhere. Clips filmed from different angles flooded social media short, shaky videos at first, then longer edits, stitched together by viewers who wanted the full story. Headlines followed quickly, each one carrying the same core truth. A woman was struck in public, and the man who did it had no idea who her husband was. But what truly captured the world's attention wasn't the name Steven Seagal. It was what didn't happen. There was no explosive fight, no revenge, no dramatic takedown. Instead, people saw restraint. Comment sections filled with reactions from across the globe. He could have destroyed him, but he didn't. That's real strength. This is how men should protect women. Others focused on the woman. She stayed calm. That took courage. She didn't need saving, she needed support. The conversation grew bigger than the incident itself. News outlets debated the role of bystanders. Social commentators talked about public accountability and the culture of silence that allows abuse to happen in plain sight. Within hours, Steven Seagal released a brief statement. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't self-congratulatory. What happened wasn't about fame. It read, "It was about respect. No one should ever be harmed because someone else lost control. We all have a responsibility to step in, to speak up, and to choose restraint over violence." The message spread faster than the footage. Meanwhile, the legal process moved forward. Authorities confirmed that the man faced charges for assault, supported by multiple eyewitness accounts and video evidence. The story was no longer a rumor or a clip taken out of context. It was documented, clear, and unavoidable. But beyond the courtroom, something quieter happened. People began sharing their own stories. Women wrote about moments they'd been harassed in public while others looked away. Men admitted times they'd stayed silent when they should have intervened. Parents spoke about using the video as a lesson for their children, not about fighting, but about responsibility. Steven and his wife avoided the spotlight as much as possible, but they couldn't avoid the impact. When asked later in a rare interview how it felt to see the moment go viral, Steven answered simply, "I wish it never had to happen," he said. "But if it reminds even one person to treat others with dignity, then something good came out of it." His wife added something just as important. "People keep calling me brave," she said, "but the truth is, I shouldn't have needed to be. Safety and respect should be normal." Those words resonated deeply. In the cafe where it all began, a small sign appeared near the counter a few days later: "Zero tolerance for abuse. Speak up. Step in." Customers noticed it. Some paused to read it twice. The staff said they'd never again hesitate to intervene. Across the internet, the incident slowly transformed from shock content into a symbol. A reminder that real power isn't loud, that protection doesn't require violence, that accountability matters more than ego. Weeks later, the story faded from headlines but not from memory. Somewhere, a man thought twice before raising his hand. Somewhere, a bystander found the courage to speak up. Somewhere, a woman felt seen instead of ignored. And that was the real ending. Not the arrest, not the fame, not even the lesson, but the ripple effect of one moment handled with restraint, dignity, and unwavering respect. Because in the end, the world didn't remember the man who struck a woman in public. It remembered the man who could have struck back and chose not to.